So yeah, the recording started. So if you could turn off your microphones during the session, we'll have a section at the end for questions. But if you do have any questions as we're going along, please put them in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end when we have the question time. Also, if you'd like captions for this, I think Teams does do some live captions as well. So you can go into your options and select more language and speech, and then you can turn on the live captions as well if you like. So just a brief agenda for today. So we're just going to have a bit of a quick introduction to the session, and then we're going to go into a bit of background to Swift ecology and conservation. And then after that, we're going to talk a little bit about Swift surveys and how you can do them, and some guidance as to how to do them. And then lastly, we're going to talk about how to use Swift Mapper, which is a kind of ready-made app for putting Swift records on to upload the records from your surveys and your sightings. And then we'll have hopefully about 15 minutes for questions at the end as well. So yeah, just as a bit of an introduction as to why we're doing this this talk tonight. We haven't done one of these before, so this is our first one. So hopefully you find it really useful. So yeah, at the RSPB, swifts are one of our kind of top priority species in recovery. The RSPB supports swift conservation through our RSPB local groups, through our volunteer teams, and also through community work. There's also a huge amount of swift conservation, which is done by local, independently run swift groups who are working, tirelessly to save swifts in their communities. So in order to protect swifts, we need to know where they're nesting. So really, the more people we have on the lookout to spot the signs of nesting swifts, the more nests we can protect. And there are huge gaps in our data as to where we have nests or where we think we might have swifts. So all of your records and sightings are really, really important. So really this training is aimed at helping you to kind of spot the signs and behaviours of nesting swifts, and also to record these on Swift Mapper, which is this ready-made app. You can get it on your phones, or you can get it online on a computer, and you can put your records on there. And this data is really, really valuable because it helps sort of local conservation groups or volunteer teams or whoever's doing swift conservation in the area. It helps them to kind of target their conservation work. And if we don't know where they are, we can't protect them. So this data is really, really valuable. And then, yeah, just a quick introduction to us. So my name is Will Bevan. I work as a project officer for England for something called the Species Volunteer Network. So this is an RSPB project which supports some of our volunteer teams across the UK who are working to sort of save some of our most vulnerable species. So I'm also involved with supporting the Greater Manchester Swift champion team. I'll now pass on to Alistair.
Hello there. Yes, I'm Alistair. I'm one of the local groups development officers in England. And part of my job is I help to look after 37 local volunteer groups throughout a large chunk of England, from the Scottish border down to the M25. And as part of that, a lot of my groups are involved in swift conservation work. I've done quite a bit of liaison with other swift groups. And that's really, I'm not a swift expert, but I'm a great swift enthusiast. And Jamie, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Alistair. I'm Jamie Murphy. I'm the Senior Conservation Officer for the West Midlands area. So for RSPB, that's Staffordshire down to Gloucestershire. But we've got West Midlands Combined Authority with Birmingham right in the middle of that. And one of our priority species is swifts. So that's where I come into it. Will and Alistair, can you both hear me okay? I've got quite a lot of background noise here, and it's not swift, sadly. So I just wanted to check that you can't hear all of that.
Yeah, we can hear you fine. Yeah.
Okay.
So the posters or the exhibits have expanded.
Cool.
We asked about putting them at.
There we go. So I'm going to be covering the background to swift ecology and conservation. And I need to take control of the slides. So I think that is there. So Yeah, we're talking about the common swift here. So the Latin name for common swift is apus, and this gives a bit of a clue to the lifestyle of swifts. So apus actually means no feet in Latin. So apus is no feet, no feet. You'll find out why. So they're a long distance migratory bird. So we actually only get them in the UK for a few months of the year. So usually they start arriving from late April. The first week in May is typically the biggest influx, and then they're here until late July, August time, usually. So swifts live on average for about 9 years. They don't actually start breeding in their first year, about 3 to 4 years typically until they start actually nesting themselves. They're site faithful birds. So what this means is they look to return to the same nesting sites year on year once they've started breeding successfully. And this is actually really important in their conservation, which I'll be getting onto. And also young swifts, they tend to try to return near the area where they're from. Not all of them, but the majority will look to return to where they grew up. So again, vital for their conservation. So swifts are now typically associated with urban areas and nest in buildings, and I'll be going into more detail on that. And crucially, they've got a very distinctive screeching or screaming call, which I'm going to just play for you. So hopefully you can all hear that. So for a lot of us in conservation, this is when you know that summer is well and truly on its way, when you start to hear swifts. And yeah, soundtrack to the summer. And usually that's what gives away swifts being in an area. You tend to hear them before you see them. So where are swifts in the world? So again, this is the common swift. There's lots of different species of swifts worldwide, but we only get one species that actually breeds in the UK. So this is a common swift, and the yellow area on this map, hopefully you can see my cursor, is where swifts actually nest, and the blue area is where they spend the winter. So a big range globally, and you'll see there's a gap in between. So they fly through there, but they don't actually stay in those areas. And a bit more detail about the UK birds. So they follow the Western Flyway. I'm not sure exactly which one it's called, but you can see it more clearly on this map. So this was one swift that was satellite tagged. So you can see it's got a small attachment to its back. Didn't do it any harm, but it meant that we could collect a lot of information. And the golf ball is a reference to the fact that a swift weighs about the same as a golf ball. So you can see here the migration route that it took. So it started off up here and flew down, had a brief stopover in Spain and Portugal, then onto the western coast of North Africa, before eventually settling in the Congo for the majority of winter, and then spending a little bit of time down in Mozambique, before returning the following year back up the west coast of Africa, through Europe, and back to the same place again in the UK. So that's just one swift, but that's the same route that the majority of the UK swifts are taking. Swift in other parts of the world take different routes to get to their parts of Africa. So where are they in the UK? So on this map, you can see all of the dark blue areas is for where the densest population of swifts are. So you might notice around London, around the West Midlands, around Greater Manchester, and all of these darker blue areas are actually towns and cities. And where they're least densely populated are away from that, typically in the more mountainous areas of the UK.
Sorry to interrupt, Jamie. I'm not getting any visuals on your mapping at all.
Okay. Did you see the pictures at all, or was it just?
No. I can see the pictures of the guests, etc. Yeah.
There wasn't any visuals. It was just a picture of a map of the UK. Can you see that?
No. No.
Okay. Is anyone else having any issues with the presentation?
I can see it.
Okay. I could potentially share my screen in a different way if other people are having issues as well. I noticed that a couple of people are having issues in the chat, so I will just stop sharing and I'll share my screen instead and see whether that works. People?
Yeah. Oh,
Okay, is that working better?
I can see that. Yeah.
yeah.
Brilliant. Okay.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you.
No problem. Yeah, well, Alistair, you can tell me to flick through when we get to the later slides. I'm happy to stay in control. So yeah, this was the map I was talking about. So you can see all the most densely populated areas tend to be where the swifts are. But it raises an interesting question because swifts have actually been around for a lot longer than humans. This is a fossil of a bird very similar to a swift from 49 million years ago in Germany. It wouldn't be the same species as the common swift that we know now, but you can see from the fossil that it's got very similar features. And for comparison, Homo sapiens as a species have been around for about 300,000 years, so vastly outdated by swift-like birds, which suggests that they're very well adapted to their lifestyle, which is being airborne, catching insects. But they're obviously now very adaptable as well because they've adapted to living in human environments. So where would they actually nest naturally? So we know they nest in some cliffs, and we also know in other parts of Europe, they still nest in some big trees. So this one is taken in Sweden, and you can just see the swift popping its head out of a hole in a big tree. This was previously a great spotted woodpecker nest years before, and the swift has basically taken over it as a nest site. Essentially, they're cavity nesting birds, so they're looking for cavities to nest in wherever they are. But this is where we tend to find them most of the time now, particularly on older houses. The most common places you're likely to find them are on the edge or the roof space under the eaves, so just underneath the roof. You never get them lower than that, really, because they need to be high up off the ground, which I'll explain shortly. But generally, wherever there's gaps and cracks that they can get into, you might find swifts nesting. And they also take advantage of the built environment and other human modified landscapes as well. So this is a quarry in Northern Ireland, and all of the numbers are different swift nests that are found in the quarry. And this is a bridge over a busy road, and you can see these red arrows here are 4 different swift nests, and you can just see swift popping its head out from under the bridge as well. So they're quite adaptable. Wherever there's cavities, they'll look to nest. So what about their nesting habits? So if both of the adult swifts survive, they will usually pair for life. And when they nest, they lay a clutch. So this is one attempt of laying eggs of 2 to 3 white eggs. It then takes about 3 weeks roughly for them to incubate the eggs before the chicks start hatching. And then interestingly, fledging, so this is when the birds are ready to leave the nest and fly for themselves. There's quite a big range there, 5 to 8 weeks. And this is quite unusual in birds because it's normally it's quite easy to predict when birds are going to fledge. But with swifts, they've got a longer range. So this is because their chicks are able to go into a state that we call torpor, which is essentially resting. So they can go for several days without eating and still survive. Basically, in a good year, if the parents are able to collect a lot of insects and feed them quickly, they're more likely to grow fast and then fledge closer to that 5-week mark. But in a year where there's perhaps more difficult for the parents to collect food, it might take them more towards the 8 weeks. We usually see them, if they've had a good year, about a week before we expect them to leave the nest, doing press-ups in the nest, so you can physically see the chicks bobbing up and down. And that's because they need to build up their flight muscles. They might not actually land for several years after they leave the nest, so they need to be ready to fly. So if they're not ready, they wouldn't be in a good state. So that's why they have to make sure they're strong enough to do that. So a few interesting facts about swifts. So I mentioned the first one already. So the reason why they're called a swift is they're very fast. So in horizontal flight, they can reach speeds of almost 70 miles an hour, which makes them one of the fastest birds in level flight. They can shut half of their brain down at a time to sleep on the wing. So this means that they can stay airborne all the time without having to land to sleep. The oldest recorded swift was 17. So all the swifts would have been doing the migration to and from Africa every year. So this would have been over 4 million miles in its lifetime, including all of the flying for food, which apparently is the distance to the moon and back 8 times. I've also mentioned that the swifts can go cold and survive days without eating. So they're very resilient birds in their own way. And here's a few closer up photos. So you can just see how much more detail there is when you see a swift close up with its feather patterns and everything. But my favourite one is this one in the middle. So This is a swift flying over a lake, catching insects. Swifts will also drink in this way, and we know that they also catch raindrops in the air to drink. So yeah, they have to be very good at flying to do all of that. But the reason why we're here, the reason why we want to get more people doing things for swifts is because they need our help. So in the UK, they've declined by almost 2/3 in their population since 1995. So for every 3 swifts that we would have had then, probably only got about 1 now. So there's a lot of different factors that come into play with the reasons for swift declines, but we think that the main causes of this are reductions in suitable nest sites. So as building standards have changed over time, as buildings have become better insulated, the gaps and the cracks that used to be there have been replaced with plastic soffits, for example, which mean that there's no gaps for the birds to nest in. We also know that insect availability generally has reduced a lot in this part of the world. So this could be a factor. We can't link that for certain because the science isn't there yet, but we've got a good reason to believe that. And also, they've got a very long migration every year, and we know that weather patterns are becoming more unpredictable. We're getting more extreme weather, so that could potentially mean that swifts struggle on their migration in some years. So all of this means they're red listed birds in the UK. One of our priorities for conservation. So what can people do to help? So this is at RSPB's Nature Reserve at Sandwell Valley. So this was the visitor centre built in 2015. These holes that you can see are actually these swift nest bricks. So they've been built into the fabric of the building when it was constructed. And once it's finished, it just looks like a hole from the outside, but it's actually got a swift nesting cavity inside. So that's if you're putting a nesting opportunity in for swifts from the beginning. But if you're retrofitting, you can also put boxes up. So there's lots of different types to fit different kinds of buildings, but there's 2 here, and all 5 of these different nesting opportunities have become occupied there, so they will work. You might be wondering what this is at the bottom. It's a swift caller. So this is literally a speaker that's wired into the building, and that's playing swift calls. And this is a good way to encourage swifts to nest in an area for the first time. The reason why this works is because swifts like to nest near other swifts. So if they hear swifts, then that's a cue for them to go and investigate. And then they'll be looking in that area for places where it might be suitable to nest. And we find this really speeds up the occupancy of new nest boxes because swifts tend to investigate them more quickly than otherwise. So just a little plug for if you're thinking about putting the nest box up, where to put them. So between northwest and northeast is quite important because if they're south facing, they can overheat, which can be an issue for the eggs and the chicks. So anywhere between northwest and northeast is the optimum place to put them. They need to be no lower than under the roof of a 2-storey house. The reason for that is when they leave the nest, they drop down and then fly up again. So if they were to be any lower than that, they risk landing on the ground and they'd find it very difficult to get up again from the ground. And then, yeah, examples on a house, you wouldn't look to put them immediately above a window if you're opening it regularly for disturbance reasons. And you wouldn't look to put it immediately next to a tree where it might interrupt the flight path or where it could be harbouring predators that could then get used to swifts coming in and out. So moving on to surveys, handing over to Alistair. So just let me know when you want me to flick to the next slide, Alistair, and I will do.
Okay, I think I can take control, can I? And
you can try.
I'll just request it. Request.
Let's see what happens with that. Can you do anything? Oh yeah, there you go. If you click, it should go to the next one, I think.
It should move, shouldn't it?
Yeah, there we go.
There we are. Right. Okay, hello again, everybody. This was mentioned briefly at the beginning of the meeting, but to talk about the real purpose, why we're actually doing the Swift surveys, a lot of it's to do with this decline in numbers. We need to understand what's happening to swifts. We need to know where they're declining, where they're increasing numbers, if that's happening anywhere. So overall, we need to have a picture of what's happening to our swift population. The other reason we want to find where they are nesting is so that we can try and ensure that those nesting sites are protected, so that if any kind of work's going on, any renovation work or insulation work, we can protect the nests and make sure that they are safe. Another reason for using the tools that we use, like Swift Mapper, and having these records, is we want to involve people in in appreciating Swifts and helping Swifts, and getting them to go out and just look for them and be aware of them is really, really important. And once they know they've got Swifts in the area, we can encourage them to put up Swift boxes, or if possible to put Swift bricks in. And when we have this information, where we know there are large numbers of Swifts, we know that's a good place to focus on putting up new boxes and putting in Swift bricks. And a final reason is that we're working very hard we've been trying to work with the government to make Swift bricks compulsory in new builds. So just to make them, they cost about 20 or 30 pounds, which in the building of a new house that's going to cost 350,000 is a trivial amount. But at the moment, the government are not supporting that. But there are a number of local councils that are. So we're trying to put not pressure, but just encourage them to make this part of their planning regulations. And if we know how many Swifts there are, or we know how the number of Swifts has changed in an area, that gives us that information, and allows us to really encourage them to take action. So you can move on. One of the first key things with surveying Swifts is to actually know what they look like. Now, I'm sure most of you who already have an interest will know this, but there's no harm in going through it again. On the left there, we have a Swift. In the middle, a swallow, and on the right, a house martin. And the most obvious distinction is that Swifts are pretty much dark all over. So they're dark on their back, they're dark on their underside, they have a very pale patch just under their chin. But swallows and house martins both have these obvious white bellies, and more obvious, they look more black and white in their markings. One of the reasons for this difference, they look very similar, but Swifts are not related to swallows and house martins. The swallows and house martins are part of the same family. Swifts belong to a completely different family. And in fact, their closest relatives are hummingbirds, which is probably one of the reasons they can flap their wings so fast and move so fast. So they've come to look like these other birds through what's called convergent evolution, which means that they've found a niche, they found a way of feeding that's the same, and they've ended up looking similar, behaving in a similar way, but are not actually related. So you'll probably know what swallow and house martin nests are like. House martins tend to build a muddy cup on the outside of a house. They're another species on the red list that are struggling, that we're trying to look after. Swallows tend to be found more in kind of suburban and rural areas, but the Swifts are darker and they're bigger. They're bigger birds, so you should be able to recognize them also by the forked tail that they have, which is slightly different, slightly broader than you'll see on the house martin, and they don't have the streamers on the swallow. But the key thing is dark all over. That's the way to tell. Right, if you're going to go out surveying, we have some safety considerations. We have these especially for the volunteers that we're responsible for on the RSPB, but they apply to pretty much anyone. So we recommend that you survey somewhere that you're familiar with, an area where you know your way around, you're not going to be lost. If possible, carry out the surveys with someone else. Make sure there's somebody else there. That's good for safety. It's also just good for spotting things, because two pairs of eyes better than one. If you do prefer to go out on your own, just make sure that somebody knows where you are when you be returning, and what to do if you haven't come back by a particular time. Carry a charged mobile phone, and as we ask people to go out sort of near dusk, that's one of the best times for seeing Swifts. Make sure you wear sort of light reflective clothing, so you're not likely to be run over by something. And if at any time you do feel unsafe during the survey, just abandon it and do whatever you need to make yourself safe. So obviously it's an unusual form of surveying. People are normally surveying birds out in the country, but this is happening in urban areas, so we have to think about these things. We also have to think about the privacy of others, because we're going to be going around looking at buildings which can seem a little bit suspect. So do use discretion and be careful. I gave a talk about swifts in a village near where I live, and then we had a walk out afterwards around the village because inevitably somebody wanted to know why 35 people were staring up at the roof of their house. It was a little bit disturbing for them. But once we explained, they were really interested and they became engaged. But something, as you can see from the Red Cross, they say don't use binoculars because it does look like you're peering up at people's bedroom windows, and it tends to be frowned upon. So try to avoid that. Just make sure you've got your specs on. You can see what's going on. And if people do come and ask in a friendly way, please tell them, because this is another way of just spreading the word and letting them know what's happening. We're hoping that we'll be able to send out some information slips that you can just give to people so they can find out a bit more. But this is a really good engagement activity just to make people often don't know what swifts are. They don't know they're in their town. Sometimes they don't even know they're in their house because they're great neighbours. They're very quiet. They don't make a mess. And sometimes people need to know, and they need to know how lucky they are to have this really rare, really astonishing bird, living in somewhere in their buildings. A quick recap of the breeding cycle that Jamie talked about earlier, partly to give you an idea of what might be going on when you survey. Now, this presentation is aimed at surveys from the beginning of the season. So normally we'd be starting in May or June, and that's when the swifts will be laying eggs. The incubation period goes on for about 19 to 21 days. For a similar reason to what Jamie said about the chicks, the swift eggs can be left for up to 3 days without being incubated, and they just kind of switch off. And when the bird comes back to sit on them, they start incubating again. So it's quite hard to predict exactly how long that will take. The fledging happens after about 5 to 8 weeks. So that's late July to early August. But the time now when you're going out, which is sort of mid-June or whatever, this is when they will be hatching. So there will be chicks in the nest probably from about now until around the end of July. So the swifts will be coming backwards and forwards to feed their chicks. And when they go out, they can catch up to about 20,000 little insects and things at one time and bring back this bolus, this great ball of insect food for them. So that's one of the things we'll be looking at. The different ages of swifts come back at different times. So the 1-year-old birds will tend to come back in July to look for possible nesting sites. They're often attracted to callers, often interested in what's going on existing nests. They usually won't go into a nest for very long. They'll often just nip in, have a quick look and come out. Or in some cases, they will just fly up and kind of hang onto the edge and have a little peek through the doorway to see if there's any good prospects there. The 2-year-olds arrive earlier, so they tend to turn up in about mid-May looking for a nest site for next year. And the 3-year-olds are the ones, they're the breeding birds that will be coming back in early May to breed for the first time. And then the older ones will come back to their traditional nest site. So at this time of year, what you will be looking for are those birds that are coming back to feed their chicks, which hopefully should happen a few times in a day. It depends again on the weather. We'll mention this shortly, but you really need to go out when it's fairly warm, fairly still. If it's very windy, there's no insects around for the swifts, so they won't be feeding in the area. They won't be around until probably quite late in the day. Or if it's raining, same thing. They tend not to be out. They will travel up to 500 miles to go and feed elsewhere and then come back. That's why they leave the chicks, because they have to go off and feed. But there should hopefully be a few birds going in and out at feeding times. Now, choosing a survey area, one of the ways you can do this, we'll be talking about Swift Mapper shortly, but that's a way of finding out where there are swifts around, and it's worth exploring that area. And what we recommend, if we're doing systematic surveys, we normally give people a 500-meter square area. And we recommend choosing roughly that area. So that's a quarter of one of the squares on an OS map. They're a kilometer square. So if you imagine that divided into quarters, you're having one of those. If you use Google Maps, there's a way of kind of measuring out roughly that sort of size. What what we need you to do is survey areas that have buildings and streets, so not kind of wetlands or canals or meadows. There may be a few swifts, flying around and feeding there, but we want to know ideally where they are nesting. So that needs to be buildings. And as Jamie mentioned, they tend to nest above about 4.5, 5 meters. So if you've got an estate of bungalows, it's very unlikely that there'll be many swifts there. They may find a little hole very high on the gable end of a house, but you really want houses of a certain size. Fairly obvious, but where it's private property, where there's no access, don't go in there. And if you can see things from a distance, that's fine, but don't trespass or intrude in any way. You need to, you use your discretion. And if you're unsure where to survey in your area and you want a hand, then give us a shout and we can let you know where might be some good areas to explore. So carrying on with the methodology, when and how often? Well, again, we normally start from the beginning of May and look at what's going on. Usually ask people to do about 2 surveys per month, so maybe about once a fortnight for about an hour or so. The best time is between about 7:30 and 10. So in the evening for dusk, which obviously changes as the months go by, but that's when there are most swifts flying low around and when they'll be coming back to nest, to roosts. So that's a good time to find them. And as mentioned, make sure it's dry and still, or you're very unlikely to see them. And it can be harder to hear them as well. That's the first sign there are swifts around usually, is when you hear them screaming. There's no set length of time. Just as long as about an hour, longer if you want, but don't spend huge amounts of time if you're not really seeing anything. Spend more time in the areas where you've already seen low-flying parties of swifts. So if you're seeing them flying around the bangers or arcs, which I'll talk about in a minute, then that's a good idea to concentrate and see if you might find some nests. Another thing we say to people is that this is quite a systematic approach, but if you're just out and about and you see swifts, then do please record them if you can make a note of them. I hope everyone can still hear me. Everyone seems to have slightly disappeared on my screen.
Yeah, all good, Alistair.
Okay, thank you. It's on, yeah. Got new broadband in my house. I'm not entirely sure about it. So just moving on. Before you do a survey, figure out a good route that you can take around the area. So this has been very roughly drawn out as a way of kind of just following your way around various streets to cover roughly a 500-meter square area. So figure out a route that you can take, and then ideally follow the same route when you go out a second time to find out, see if anything has changed, or if you're picking up anything that wasn't there before. We've got some information on the methodology and we've got some survey forms, which I think we'll send out at the end of this. We've got everyone's email, so we'll send that information to them. And as far as actually recording the data, in a way, it's up to you how you record it. At the time, you may want to take a clipboard and a pen or pencil and just write down what you've seen. But where we want to collect the actual data is on SwiftMapper, which is an app that was developed by the RSPB in conjunction with Swift Conservation, the BTO, and a software developer. Now it can be downloaded to a phone as an app. You can get it for Google phones and also for Apple phones. There's also a website. You can just go on a laptop or any other computer. So we'd like people to go onto SwiftMapper and register to use that, and use that to record the data that they find. So there we are. There we've got one of our wonderful Manchester volunteers doing some surveying. So what do you need? So if it helps, print out a map of where you're going to go, or have it marked on a street map or something. Take a clipboard and pencils if that's useful. We've got forms for low-flying swifts and also for nesting swifts. Or if you're happy using the app, you can use it just out in the street. As mentioned, a charged phone in case of emergencies. And if you can, take some leaflets that we can provide to give to people if they're asking any questions, just for that engagement side of things. So what are you looking for? What are we actually trying to spot? Well, we want to see low-flying swifts. And by that, we mean ones that are just coming down low near to the rooftops, not way up high in the sky. Another reason swifts do well in cities is not just the nesting spaces, but because they feed very high. And in cities, often the levels of pollution mean fewer insects, but higher up, there's less of it. And so they can feed. So they tend to feed very high. We're not interested in them. We want the ones that are coming down very close to the buildings. And we're also trying to find the nesting swifts, so actually find the ones that are going into the eaves of houses, that are going into swift bricks, that are going into nest boxes. That's what we want people to look for. So some behaviours to look out for: screaming parties. This is not a bunch of toddlers who have had too much jelly and ice cream. It's actually what the swifts do en masse. They will go charging down the street, making this astonishing racket. For a variety, we're not 100% sure why they do this, but one of the reasons is thought to be they're trying to find out if there are other swifts around. And this is why swift callers work, because a swift caller plays the sound of a male and a female swift duetting. And that means there's a nest and it's a good place to go. So if you hear that, that's a good sign. Start looking out. Arcs, if you come across a low-flying group, watch closely where they're going, if they're within 1 or 2 meters of buildings. And the other thing to look out for are bangers. The young swifts will fly past what they think may be nest sites and scream. If they don't get a response, they'll go past and give it a whack with their wing as they go by. So that's something else to look out for. And what are you noting down? Well, for low-flying swifts, we want to know the address and the location and the date, the number of swifts you've seen at roof height, and any comments, any behavior notes, anything that you've noticed. For nesting swifts, we would like to know the actual, if possible, building that they're going into, the location and the date, how many nests, if there's more than one nest, the types of nests. This can all be recorded in Swift Mapper. So are they going into a natural nest? Are they going into Swift brick? Are they going into a nest box? The number of years that nest being used, if known, if it's something that's been reported before, the building type and age, because this is quite helpful. It's broken down into about 3 categories, so kind of pre-war buildings, post-war, and more modern. So you've got to have a basic knowledge of architectural history. Nest site at risk, well, that's if it's something where scaffolding is going up or it looks like there's some renovation work going on, and then any other comments that you want to put in there. Now, I'm going to hand over to Jamie again, because he's going to do a quick demonstration of how to use Swift Mapper, how to actually use the app. It's remarkably straightforward. So if someone just asked a question about would you input the number of the house if you spotted a nest, well, actually, if you mark it on Swift Mapper, it will actually record that data. It will know probably where the house number is. But so yeah, that's kind of built into the app. So Jamie, I will hand over to you.
Thanks, Alistair. So yeah, don't worry too much about remembering all of that information that you need to collect, because it will be asking you prompts when you're in Swift Mapper to put those answers in. Before I go into a demo, we give people forms when we do survey projects, because some people prefer to write it down on a piece of paper and then come home and put it in Swift Mapper. But actually, all of the data entry happens online, so you don't need to return the forms in the post or anything like that. If you aren't able to enter the data online yourself, then if you've got a local RSPB contact that you're working with, feel free to take a photo or scan of the recording form and map and send it through. And also, as Alistair said earlier, if you see swifts just as you're out and about, you can use Swift Mapper in exactly the same way. Just when you see swifts, you don't have to be doing a survey to use Swift Mapper. So on the website, you'll have this add record button and options to put things in. And on the app, on the phone, it looks very similar, and you've got your add record at the bottom there. But yeah, I'm going to get into the demo. So hopefully you can see Swift Mapper now on the screen. This is an area of Manchester that I don't know, so I'm just going to zoom in and see what happens. So it's a really good way to explore where swifts are. So all of these blue ones are low-flying swift. So if you click on them, it tells you how many there were, what year it was. All of the yellow ones are nesting swifts, which tells you again the year and how many nests there are. There's red for previously occupied nests that aren't occupied anymore. And there's also, in some places, lots of Swift boxes. So Swift boxes can be recorded on there as well. And that's the green. So you don't need to have an account to look where Swifts are. But if you want to put your own records in, you do need to set up an account, but it's all free. Once you're logged in and you've got your account, you press the add record button. And I just do a couple of examples. So screaming party. So this, if you see low flying Swifts going past houses, you click on this one. And then you can click on where it is. So let's say it was on this one, Veronica Road. You can even zoom in and it tells you the number of the house. So if you're outside it, you can see the number, click on it, and that's the record going in. So then you press, you can also see existing records as well, to see what's nearby. And you can toggle that on and off. If you press next, it asks you how many. So let's just say it's 3 Swifts and you're certain that it's a Swift. If you've got a photograph, you can add them in, but it's not a requirement. If you've got any comments that you want to add, you can. And also if you're part of a local Swift network or a volunteer group that's got a keyword, you can add that in as well. And then you just press the review button. And once you're happy, you press submit. Now, I'm not going to do that because it's not a real record, but as you can see, very quick, very easy. So let's say it's a nesting Swift. So we'll choose occupied nest instead and click on the building, and it will ask you how accurate that is. So if it is on the house exactly, you can say yes. If it's not on the house exactly, you can say no. And if you're not sure, say unsure. But let's say it is exactly there. It then asks you a few questions. So this is what was on the previous slide. So how many nests? Let's say it's 1. If it's the first time you've seen it, you can say 0, 1 year's occupied. It will ask you whether the site's at risk. So is there any scaffolding up or any clear building works going on? If not, you can say no. Type of nest, you're going to be looking for hole in roof or wall. And building type, it just gives you a drop-down list here. So in this case, it'd be a house. And if you know the building age, you can choose one of these categories. And if you're not sure, you can just put unsure. Again, it asks for a photograph, comments and keywords as with previous, but that's all that's required. And then you go through and submit, and then that will appear in the records on SwiftMapper. Now, the last thing you can do is download information from a certain area. So you have to be on a computer to do this. But say you decided that this down here was going to be your survey area. If you click on the filter button here, it gives you a draw boundary option. And you can click around the area that you want to survey. And when you're happy, you can double click. It selects an area. And then if you press this download button with the cloud here, you can then download the selected records, and that will be downloaded to your computer as an Excel file, so you can see it all at once and see what's going on there. So I'll stop there with the demo and back over to Will now, just to finish up before we have any questions. There you go.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Jamie and Alistair as well. Really excellent, and so much information in there as well. And yeah, like we said, don't worry about remembering everything that we've been talking about today. We're going to be sharing the recording afterwards with you. We'll probably send it to your email addresses, and we might put it up on YouTube as well, so you can watch it back. And we'll also share the presentation slides as well. I'm going to be putting together a bit of a resource pack for people, so that'll have the recording, the recording forms in. Might have some sort of leaflets that you can hand out to people as well, and sort of any more information that we might think will help you with your surveys. If you would like to have sort of printed copies of leaflets and things like that, if you send me an email, then I can actually post them out to you if you'd like, to sort of hand them out. I realise that not everybody has printers, and printing can also cost quite a bit. So if anyone would like some sort of resources posted to them, if you let me know, I can send some out to you. And also, if you're not already connected with sort of local groups, local Swift groups, or RSPB groups, or volunteer teams in your area, and if you'd like to be connected, or if you'd like to be a part of those teams, do let us know. We can try and help you find a group that's sort of local to you, and some other people who are doing Swift conservation in the area. So yes, yeah. So does anybody have any questions? I realised there was some questions in the chat, and I think that Alice has been answering a few of them. But I think there might have been a few. I don't know, Alistair, had we covered all of the questions? And if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask now.
Beautiful. Markings in the head.
I've been trying to answer them as best I can. One of them is somebody did ask about councils that have made Swift bricks compulsory, and I have got somewhere a document that a lovely lad from our youth council put together. He kind of trawled through all these council planning policy websites in the country. I can dig that out. I can pass that on to Will if he wants to send it out to people just to have an idea. That was, I think, last year, so it might not be 100% up to date, but we know there've been a few new ones since, but it might be a useful starting point. Or just have a look as well. So have a look at your local council website planning information. It's often in the local plan information as well. That's worth looking for.
There was another question about photographs, I think, from Leslie about do we need owner permission to use photos? So I guess that's photos of, I guess, nest sites on houses and things like that, putting them on Swift Mapper.
Yeah, so I always advise with this, if you haven't got permission from the homeowner, then yeah, you probably wouldn't want people posting photos of your house on there online without permission. So yeah, don't do it unless you've got permission to do that. I think the reason why that functionality is in there is if people have got Swift nesting in their own houses and they're willing to do that, or if they put boxes up and they want to have photos for people to see on there, then they're able to do so.
I think also going back to the information about addresses. So like we said, it automatically, when you put the record on, that'll record the address. But when you go and look at the record on Swift Mapper itself, and it isn't your record, you won't be able to see the address. But that has been recorded by Swift Mapper. So the address has been recorded, even if it doesn't show that information on Swift Mapper. And if you look at your own records, it should hopefully show that the addresses of the places that you've put your records on.
There was something I didn't show you on Swift Mapper, but once you've got an account, if you click on your account, you can see all of the previous records that you've inputted, and it tells you the addresses and where and how many birds there are. So if you're regularly going back to the same place, and say, for example, you saw 8 swifts flying low down a road, and then you went again a couple of weeks later, and you saw 10 swifts flying down the same road, you wouldn't have to necessarily put that in as 2 separate records. You can go back into your account, you can edit previous records to the latest date and increase the number from 8 to 10. So instead of having lots of different records from the same year, you can edit your record from the previous visit just to have that maximum number that you've seen going down the road. Was there any other questions, Will, that we haven't answered yet?
Yeah, there was another. I think we've had a couple about whether there's data sharing agreements with local record centres.
Oh, okay.
I think there was one from Jack saying, yeah, I'd like to make sure that their Swift Mapper records are available to inform local conservation.
Yeah, so it's different in different areas, basically. So some councils and council ecologists will use Swift Mapper, but I know that a lot of them only use other apps like Bird Track, and they're relying on that. So in some areas, volunteers have actually taken on roles of transferring Swift Mapper information into Bird Track to make sure that all of that gets captured when planning decisions are being made. But it's worth contacting your local planning authority to ask them if they're using it to work out whether it's something that's worth doing in that area.
Yeah, I think Swift Mapper, I think, makes a good exploratory tool for kind of really easily seeing where you might have swifts and nests that need protecting, and I think it kind of functions as that way. But yeah, like Jamie said, in some areas we have been having volunteers and people kind of adding those records to local record centres as well. There was a question from Stacey about recording, so a group of 100 swifts on the moors, and also 60 near a church in Edgeworth, Bolton. So I guess if they fit the criteria of being a screaming party, so in terms of the flying behaviour and things like that, that is something you would record on SwiftMapper. But it's worth noting if there are other records of swifts. So, for example, if you do see high flying swifts and things like that in your area, they might still be worth recording on things like bird track, and that information can still be used as well.
Yeah, the high flying swifts are usually a good indicator that there will be swifts nesting somewhere nearby. But because they can travel quite far, it's not necessarily immediately in the area that you are. So it's a good clue, but then you're waiting to see them coming down low to roof level to start inputting them into SwiftMapper.
There's the question from Sue about unoccupied nest boxes. And there are two nest categories on SwiftMapper, which are occupied nest and nest box. And I've always been slightly confused by what those mean.
I can tell you.
I think a nest box is really a nest box that's being used, isn't it? Or do you have a nest box and an occupied nest?
You can use the nest box one just to say that you put a box up and it isn't occupied yet.
Yeah.
So the green ones are where boxes are, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're occupied. So you have to click on them to find out whether they are. Yeah.
There's a question from Stuart about would one or two swifts screaming constitute a party? I appreciate SwiftMapper is an RSPB tool, but is there not value in reporting to the local ecology unit as well?
Yes, so it doesn't have to be a big group to constitute a party. If you have one or two flying low over a house, then it's still an indicator that they might be interested in nesting in the area. So it doesn't have to be over a certain size. And yeah, the reason why we've got SwiftMapper is to try and make all of this data readily available for everybody and have a place that's easy for everyone to access to see this information. But you're right that there is still value reporting it to a local ecology unit because, as I mentioned before, there's no guarantee that the local ecology team at the planning authority are using SwiftMapper. So the more people that are telling them about it or sharing records with them, the more likely they are to take on that information when they're making decisions about new developments.
So I think that's yeah, all we've got time for now. But if you do have any more questions afterwards, please do yeah, send your questions to me. There's my contact email there. I can put it in the chat as well. And I will most likely tomorrow I will send out the recording once it's downloaded and yeah, all of the resources, the survey forms and things like that. And yeah, if you do have any more questions or yeah, you'd like to be connected with your local Swift groups or anything like that, please do let me know. But yeah, thanks so much for coming tonight. Really good to have you along and I hope it's been really informative. So I hope you all have a good evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Phil. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Sorry. Oops.